I want to sort of throw it back to what you did yesterday afternoon with Stephen, where you started working with a specific tool. I mean, in this course, the tool that we decided to use is Power BI because it's fairly straightforward, all things being equal, and you have a fair amount of ability to customize your charts along the way. But this morning, what we're going to try to do is to reinforce the important precepts that go into data visualization. The idea that we're trying to tell a story with data, and that's software agnostic. It doesn't matter whether you're using Power BI, or ggplot2, Excel, whatever tool you want to use. These are the concepts that you sort of have to keep in the back of your mind whenever you produce something. Now, I'm at the point in my career where I don't typically explicitly ask myself the storytelling questions when I produce a visualization, because I've internalized a lot of these questions. Like, I've been doing this for a fair amount of time now, and the questions arise naturally as I'm working with the data. But when we start the data visualization process, when we start learning about data visualization, it's sort of important to highlight or explicitly write these things out. All right? So we shall start with the storytelling part. This is actually a pretty interesting part from my point of view. This is the data visualization that comes with the communication part of the analysis process. Like, I've spoken a little bit about using data visualization to help explore the data set, to help inform the modeling process, the analysis process. Once everything is said and done and you've worked with your data, you've managed to extract insights out of it, you need to communicate the results, right? If you do not play that part, if you do not play the game of communication at the end, everything you've done has been for naught. Nobody sits with data, analyzes it, and does nothing with it, right? That's a completely sterile process. You need to be able to communicate. For you to pick the right visualizations for the result, you need to know who your audience is. But what does that really mean, knowing your audience? More often than not, when we think of our audiences, we have the various lines of businesses. I'm producing this visualization for finance, for engineering department, for the HR department, for some specific department, for the DG and her cadre of employees. Every once in a while, we produce visualizations for a general audience. I mean, in a sense, it's a bit like being an artist. It's like, I want to reach as wide an audience as possible. Everybody will know what I can do and what the analysis. I mean, it's great in theory, but in practice, if we work with general audiences, we end up trying to be all things to all people, and our visualizations suffer as a result, and consequently, the message that we're trying to convey also suffers. So knowing who your audience is will help you decide what the best charts would be, what the layout would be, how big, how complex, how simple you make your visualizations. That requires you to have some insight into who the decision makers are and what the various roles in the audience. So you're not isolated from the pipeline, the workflow. You have to be involved, presumably, with the data collection if you can. And if you can't, you have to be involved with the data cleaning process. You're not just going to be the recipient of the data or the recipient of the results of the analysis and then turn it around into something that somebody else will find interesting. In a sense, it's ideal if you, as a producer of charts, you're also a member of the audience, right? You can't always guarantee that that's going to be the case, but you can't discard your own role as the potential audience. You have specific questions that you have to ask about the decision makers and the people who have various roles in the audience. What is your relationship with them? How do they perceive you? How do you establish trust and credibility? Your audience makes decisions very quickly. Are they going to be interested in your story, or are they not going to be interested in your story? If you don't think about it, if you speak to a general audience, very often you'll miss the boat. Missing the boat typically leads to your story not having the same impact as it could have had. So what do you want your audience to know or do? Well, basically, it's a call for action whenever you produce a visualization. What are the decisions that people are going to make from the analysis? Do you have an idea what that is? That should inform how you present the results. How often are they going to be looking at the data? Is this a one and done deal? Or is this being refreshed every week, refreshed every time they go on the website to sort of like to see the new charts? How often do they expect the data to be refreshed as well? So it's actually pretty important to get to know your audience and to have an idea as to what it is that they want out of the charts. How do we communicate with the audience, right? Because we're not going to be sitting there with the audience when they're watching our display and we're looking at them and saying, did you like that? Did it work? So how do we actually communicate with the audience? You need to know what data is actually available to you. You need to know if the data has been cleaned. You need to know if the data can be accessed and if it's being massaged, used to paint a rosy picture. If you're involved in the analysis process, you have answers to these questions. If you're not, if you're just a recipient of an analysis, you don't necessarily know, you need to try to figure out answers to these questions. To be an effective data visualizer, you sort of need to be a little bit of an annoyance, right? You need to pester people. And some people might not feel that it's any of your business to know the answer to these questions. It's easy for me. I'm not an employee, and usually when I do data visualizations, I do so as a consultant. And as a consultant, you're the external person. They're paying you a fair amount of money to do the work. They'll listen to you when you ask questions. They might not like it, but they'll answer the question. How much will the audience need to interact with the charts? Do they want to interact with the charts? Eventually, Stephen is going to show you how you can do filters and little menu drops with Power BI, and you can modify the charts on the fly to only slice the data a certain way and look at the chart, this specific chart as opposed to another chart. Is this something that people will want you to do or not? Is the audience going to be passive? Are they going to be able to run limited filtering? Do they want to run limited filtering? Will they want to be able to download the data that is used to create the chart? Do they need to do so? Is this something you can actually make available to them? There's a very famous story here. It's going to sort of highlight the importance of storytelling and understanding context. In the Second World War, there's a British mathematician called Wall, very famous mathematician. We have a bunch of tests named after him. He was involved in a study to help protect British planes, bombers, that would fly over Germany. What he had as data was the number and location of the bullet holes on the returning aircraft. Now, obviously, the Germans weren't just sitting there and waiting to be bombed. The goal was to use the information, the location and the number of the bullet holes, to try to determine where armor should be added, right? To try to make planes more resistant, make the structure more stable. So out of this, they created a chart, and the chart was showing where the maximum number of bullet holes were located on the aircraft that returned. And here I'm bolding this little bit because that's actually super important. We had no information on the aircrafts that didn't return. Well, no direct information, but we were eventually able to infer information. The chart that, was used to build this model of where armor should be built only had observations for the aircrafts that returned. And then you saw a lot of damage on the extremities, like the end of the wings, but not on the main wing itself, and not on the tail spars, the engines, and the core fuselage areas. You get something that looks like this. We're seeing this, and this is where the holes are. This is what we should be protecting. So the Air Ministry said, well, we should be adding armor to these extremities. But Walt said, no. This isn't at all what needs to happen. The planes that got hit in the locations where we had no bullet holes on the returning planes, they never made it back. These are the areas that need to be protected. So even though at first glance, the chart shows you location of holes and so potentially where armor should be added, a little thought about this makes you think, no, that's the opposite, right? We have a bias in the data, and you're only ever going to be able to visualize the data that you have. You can't visualize the data that you do not have. The survivorship bias, you cannot escape it. But the data that is missing may be as important to the story. In this case, it was more important to the story than the data that is there. Telling a story about the data requires you to have a pretty good understanding of the situation that the data is meant to represent and the mechanism that underlies missing data. You're going to hear me say this over and over again because I think this is a point that's really important. And this is something I try to teach my students. But data is just data, right? Without context, without understanding where the data lives and lies and resides, the charts that we produce could be technically correct, but entirely useless or even misleading. It's not sufficient. Otherwise, we cannot tell the story.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce to the group that actually, a lot of the times people kind of overlook this section, but in my experience of developing dashboards, this is probably the most important thing. We don't think charts tell a story, but if you actually watch a senior person in a meeting doing a presentation, trying to get money for something, you can really see the narrative storytelling that's going on. They're trying to make the audience feel sad or panicked or excited. They're trying to make the audience fall in love with them or hate somebody else. And the charts that are derived in the PowerPoint presentation in the background reinforce that story. And sometimes this is done very, very well. Those are the people that get the money they want. And sometimes this is done very, very badly. And those are the people that don't get the promotions. So people say, well, it's not a story in terms of, you know, there's a romance or there's a Lord of the Rings. And my argument there actually is, there's a direct analogy with that. So when we're preparing a dashboard, for example, do we want to present the good or bad information first? Do we want to build up the narrative and give people a background and then lead into the sucker punch halfway down the page or 3 pages in? So it's a hard one to abstract out. And actually, it takes a little time to wrap your head around it. But it's a really good exercise when you're looking at your charts. For example, I did one on staffing for a Treasury Board sub. And, you know, the story behind that dashboard was, we need people to help us, right? We've got more money than we expected, and we need HR and we need IT support to actually help us staff it very quickly. And the entire dashboard was built around that. So really, really think about the narrative and the story, because that really helps to design the dashboard.
So Stephen mentioned a number of potential narratives, like you might just go chronological, show things as they happen in order. I mean, that's a very natural sort of way of trying to understand a situation. Well, this first happened, and when the result of this was this other thing, and then that led to this and this and that. That's a decent way to craft a narrative. You could also decide to show the most important thing first. Like, this is what you need to get out of this presentation. This is what you need to get out of the dashboard. Or perhaps you'll start with the least important thing first to build up to a crescendo. You might begin with the end, like a sort of narrative structure. If you've ever watched, think Memento as a movie where you see the last scene first and then eventually it builds back up to the first scene. Sometimes people will go with the successes first and the bad news last, or the other way around. It really depends on the story you're trying to tell. Our piece of advice here is that you should tell the story of the data in a number of different ways. Because we have what we call the no free lunch theorems. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. An approach that worked well once for a specific situation and specific data might not work at all for a slightly different situation with slightly different data for a slightly different audience. The narrative you craft, of course, also depends on the audience for these dashboards. This is actually super important. The only way to really teach this is for people to try dashboards that fail at conveying the story, that haven't crafted the right narrative. And then you learn, okay, this didn't actually do quite what I want. Or to be a student of stories. Right? Look around you, TV shows, movies, politicians, narrative crafting which distorts the data. That is a no-no no matter what. But there's a lot of things you can do to craft a story around your data without lying. How do you maintain a clear narrative? You have 2 types of logics here, and of course some mixtures of these logic. You can have horizontal logic. So if your visualizations are going to span many pages, if you're going to have a dashboard with many pages, basically the title of each page should be sufficient to tell you the story. And this is something you could reinforce with an executive summary dashboard or some report at the beginning. And then for the rest of the dashboard, we'll do a deeper dive in every single one. You can also come up with a vertical logic for your narrative. So there, the content should reinforce the title and vice versa, self-reinforce. So you can do this on one page or many pages. The idea, though, is that you should have a logical link between all of the elements, all the tags, all the visual aids on the page. And I think naturally, but unless you have a story, unless you know what the narrative is going to be, you can't sort of design a narrative on the fly in the dashboard. Like, you need to have some sort of storyboarding component. In order to make sense of storytelling, we need to understand the ways in which stories engage our memory. There's three types of memories that are worth sort of talking about here: the iconic memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Let's talk about these types of memories a little bit, but let's keep in mind that you are also a viewer, a consumer of the dashboard, and you should verify how the dashboard works with your memory. The iconic memory is the visual sensory memory. Specific technical details, perhaps it doesn't matter. And it relates to the visual domain. It's a fast decaying, high capacity store of visual information. So it's something you can capture a lot of visual information very quickly, except your memory will dry out. Iconic memory is very brief. It gives you a coherent representation of the entire perception. One of the consequences of this is that it's attuned to pre-attentive attributes, the types of things you notice without really thinking. If I show you the chart on the right, in each of these collection of points, there should be one point that jumps at you without you having to think about it. And one thing we're very good at capturing very quickly is motion. Obviously, on a slide here, I can't show you like motion in motion, but if you can imagine an interactive display where points are moving, we are naturally drawn to these things. The short-term memory, most people can hold about 4 chunks of visual information, whatever that would be. You can't really hold more than 4 in your short-term memory. So if you're given too many chunks, too many data points on a graph, you'll need to basically process them in and out of memory. And long-term memory, well, this is usually something that is built up over a lifetime. And that's the basis for pattern recognition. When you sit down and you actually really look at the visualization, then you can use your experience and the knowledge you've accumulated over your life to really make sense of the data, to capture specific things in the data, to see insights. It's an aggregation of both visual and verbal memory. The thing with images is they can help us recall long-term memory, and then that makes the story stick. Adding some text as well helps things stick. 2 ways here to show the same information. Which of those 2 do you think is more likely to stick in your mind? Which of the 2 ways to present this information is more likely to stick? So there's various aspects of memory, various types of memory. What sticks in your mind, what needs to be, if you're writing a book, look at the bottom 2 gray rectangles on this slide here. If you're writing a book, you probably want to use the text on the left, right? I mean, yeah. You've currently selected 28,000 whatever and ATIP requests, and there's like 6.5 million pages of information. It's true, it gives me context. I understand this sentence. I know what the data is about. But if I look away, I've already forgotten. Whereas if I look at the right image with the 2 little things, I'm seeing, okay, well, there's about, 28, 7, 11. Who's going to remember that number? Nobody. Nobody remembers this in long-term memory. That's not a number you remember. Like, you might remember in long-term memory that Wayne Gretzky once had 250 points in a season, but that's something that I've built over my years. Ask me again 3 slides from now what that number is, 28,711. I can't remember it at all. But perhaps what's useful, if you look at the 2 boxes, is to see a number which is about 38,000 for requests, and a number of pages which is about 6.6 million. Like, the number of pages is substantially larger than the number of requests. Does it matter if I know the exact number? No, probably not. But I know that there was, I can think of it in terms of thousands, I can think of it in terms of millions, requests, pages, this is right. Okay. So for a dashboard, that thing on the right here is probably a smarter move than this thing on the left. But for a report or a textbook or a paper or journal article, or you name it, the thing on the left could be useful. Except the thing on the left provides you with context. A tip is written there, pages of information, sort of makes sense. Without a title on the right, something's missing, right? We have to be smart about the way we present this information. We have to basically make it work with our memory and what we think is important to remember down. Storyboarding, it's really the process that we use to craft a narrative that Stephen and I think is so important in order to produce good data visualizations. You do it to summarize the flow of information into what we call a coherent whole, so that when people consume your dashboard, they don't ever think that something's out of place. It's like, oh, why do we have this here? What's the point? Or what's missing? None of this sort of comes into their mind. They're viewing the object as an entirety composed of various pieces, and all the pieces fit neatly together. It'll help you determine how many pages you'll have and how many elements per page you'll have. But this isn't the part where you decide what kind of chart you're going to have in the bottom right corner of your third page. It's one level up from that. So you're not designing the layout of the dashboard so much as thinking what needs to go into the dashboard in order for you to define the story properly and to convey the information you want to convey.
Just a really quick one. This is actually a real one. It's somewhat simplified, but this was a couple of years ago. Fisheries and Oceans applied for 2 Treasury Board subs, actually a few more. Everybody expects to get 30 or 40%. They ended up getting 100%. They got about $1.5 billion worth of ocean protection, and they got another lots of money for critical infrastructure. And hence, they decided to hire 2,000 people in a year. So there was a dashboard designed at a very high level that I helped design to actually help manage that. So it's like, what on earth is this dashboard going to look like? So we storyboarded it out. So, you know, the first thing is the hiring goal for the year is 2,000 people above net churn, right? The second part of the story is, what is driving this? Well, it's OPP, but that's broken up into different divisions. That's broken up into Coast Guard, different science departments, and so on. But it shows the drive and also links to the TB sub annexes that have the actual specific hiring goals in there. Then, as we go through the year, we want to show how close or far we are away from that goal. You know, if we're 10% in in April, we're fine. If we're 10% in and we're in February, we're in a problem, right? So, you know, we want to show how far or close we are to the goal. Within the department, there's different groups. Which ones of those have the highest requirements? Coast Guard had 50% of everything. We need to direct resources there or monitor them more specially. Which groups were impacted the most? This is, we've got information security, real property, a whole bunch of different groups in the department, enabler groups. How are they impacted? This drove Fisheries and Oceans getting space in Esplanade on Laurier. And there was arguments with ADMs, and PSBC deputy ministers got involved at this. The dashboard needed to show IT is impacted this much, real property is impacted this much, where the problems are. And then this dashboard was really aimed at an ADM level and DG level, and it was basically saying, you're in charge of things at DFO, here are the numbers, your job is to find out how you can come up with activities to change these numbers. So this looks like 6 very innocuous boxes. But these 6 boxes drove a dashboard, actually a series of dashboards that ended up being about 6 or 7 that actually allowed DFO to manage those hiring goals. It was very, very powerful. If we didn't have this storyboard, we'd have been toast.
What we want you to take away from all this is that in order to come up with a decent dashboard, it's not sufficient to work with the data and get something nice, but you need to think about what you want to see, who needs to see it, how it needs to be presented so that the message is conveyed. The story achieves the goals that you have. And if you do not have explicit goals, you won't be able to achieve them. You don't know. We do not, in general, advise doing visualizations on the. It's great if you're technically proficient. It's great if you know how to use Power BI. It's great if you know color theory and all these other things. But unless you have a plan, objectives for the dashboard, unless you know who the audience is, unless you know specifically what it is you want them to remember, what it is you want for them to remember tomorrow, a week from now, a year from now, your visualizations are going to be at best middling. So it's more important to spend time on the storytelling, crafting the narrative, understanding the objectives and the goals than it is knowing how to use any specific tools. So when I speak about being software agnostic, this is what I mean. R, Python, Excel can do great charts as long as you build them properly.